So good afternoon, or whatever time it is where you're at, and welcome to this year's Thomas R. Trautmann Honorary Lecture. I'm David Brick from the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, and I'm excited to have with us here today Professor Stephanie Jamison from the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA. However, before saying a few words about Professor Jamison's work and her many impressive scholarly accomplishments, I want to say a few words about Professor Trautmann, who spent his entire career in the Department of History here at the University of Michigan. As a classical Indologist myself, I have had the pleasure of reading and rereading many of Professor Trautmann's fine works on early India, and I must say that I stand in complete awe of the enormous breadth of his knowledge, his meticulous attention to detail, and his uncanny ability to draw from primary sources profound insights about the nature and history of early Indian society. His first book, A Study of the Arthashastra, is a real gem that still continues to influence the study of that important text on early Indian statecraft today. His second book, An Ambitious Study of Dravidian Kinship, is even better, in my humble opinion. And while Professor Trautmann went on to make enormous contributions to the study of colonial India in subsequent decades of his career, his interest in classical South Asia has continued throughout his career, as one can see from his 2015 book, Elephants and Kings, which is a sweeping history of human interactions with elephants in largely pre-modern South Asia, or Asia in general, I should say. Now, turning to Professor Jamison, our speaker today, we have another scholar that I hold in the highest regard and for whom I have the greatest admiration. Stephanie Jamison is professor of Indo-Iranian languages in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA. Among her many professional services, she is the longtime South Asia editor of the Journal of the American Oriental Society, the premier English language journal for the study of classical India, among other subjects. Professor Jamison received her PhD from Yale University in 1977 under the guidance of Stanley Insler, and is the author of many books and articles, far too many to recount here. She has published widely on Indo-Iranian and Indo-European linguistics, poetics, ritual, mythology, and law, with a special focus on Vedic Sanskrit. In 2014, with Joel Brereton, she produced the first complete English translation in over a century of the Rig Veda, the very earliest surviving Sanskrit text. And two of her earlier books, Ravenous Hyenas and the Wounded Son, and Sacrificed Wife, Sacrificer's Wife, have long been effectively required reading for any aspiring Indologist, whether or not he or she intends to specialize in Vedic myth and ritual. The title of Professor Jamison's talk today is Indian Animals Are Good to Think With. We are holding this event in a meeting format and ask that all of you keep your microphones muted during the talk. There's going to be a question and answer session after the lecture. So now please join me in welcoming Professor Jamison.
I'm very honored to be here and especially honored to be asked to deliver this lecture in honor of Professor Trautmann. I would first ask, I wish I were among you, of course, in person, and I also ask your indulgence for an old person who is not altogether adept either with PowerPoints or Zoom, and together they make an unholy alliance. But now I will share my screen and hope that this works. Okay. Okay, can you see that? Yes? Someone tell me you can see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Someone has told me. Okay. I'm a great admirer of, well, let me first advance to myself and then further to advance to Professor Trautmann. I am a great admirer of his work, which has helped shape the scholarly views of South Asian history and socio-political organization for many decades. But much as I appreciate his work on kinship, on the Aryan question and the gripping text of the Arthashastra, all of which Dave has already introduced you to. I confess that my favorite is indeed the recent book, Elephants and Kings, which in a majestic sweep of time, from prehistory to the present day, of space, from China and Southeast Asia to Europe and North Africa, and of culture, from the Vedic period through the great empires of the Mauryans and Guptas and their Western counterparts, and the Mughal role that followed, convincingly argues for the apparently counterintuitive hypothesis that the fates of elephants and of Indian kings were deeply intertwined, and that, in particular, it was the need for the royal enterprise to capture huge numbers of mature wild elephants to train that enabled elephants to survive in the wild in the subcontinent. I have a special fondness for this book and its subject, partly because it was an elephant that made me a Sanskritist, albeit a grammatical elephant. Over 50 years ago, when I first started learning Sanskrit from the primer of Edwin Delavan, Edwin Delavan Perry, as people did then, and my students still do. In the second lesson of the primer, I, who was barely launched in the language and was meeting my very first nouns, encountered the homework sentence, Kutraduna Gajam Nayami, to be rendered in a tone somewhat between plaintive and desperate. Where do I lead the elephant now? And I knew at once that a language that delivered me an elephant in the first week was one worth pursuing. As an aside, I think I may be the only student who has ever reacted to that sentence that way. In fact, every year I ask my students to identify the sentence in lesson 2 that launched me on my career, and no one ever does. In Elephants and Kings, Professor Trautmann demonstrates that what might seem to be a limited focus on a particular animal, the elephant, opens out on a vast terrain of topics that amount to a political, social, cultural, and environmental history of Eurasia over 3 millennia. I cannot hope to replicate the range and depth of learning displayed in this book, but I too have found over the decades that looking at odd facts or apparent facts about animals in Indian texts can take us in unexpected directions and lay bare covert attitudes and surprising connections that derive from the original audience's knowledge of animal physiology and behavior. Such diverse minutiae as the number of toes on a rhinoceros's foot, the mating behavior of frogs, and the maternal habits of hyenas have caught my attention over the years, and I will share with you some of the weird byways I have entered by stumbling over a small but disruptive textual bump in the road. One of the points that will come up again and again is the remarkable degree of field observation of the real animal that informs the literary and religious treatment of animals in Sanskrit texts. In suggesting that animals can be a lens through which to view Indian culture over the millennia, I am stating what is blindingly obvious to anyone with even a superficial acquaintance with ancient and medieval India. Animals are ubiquitous and multivalent in Indian texts and serve diverse functions. We should start with the animal fable, which is the medium in which ancient Indian literature seems first to have made its way to the West. The most famous collection of animal fables in India is the Panchatantra in its many forms, which Franklin Edgerton claimed was the most widely circulated book in the world after the Bible. I cannot pronounce on the correctness of this claim, which was surely meant to more to awe and surprise than to present itself for verification. But there are over 200 versions of it in more than 50 languages, and its spread to the West is amply documented. The work is a mirror for princes, with the main characters a lion and a bull who become devoted friends, and a couple of wily jackals of ministerial rank who break up this friendship by clever politics. Embedded in this frame story, a characteristic Indian form, are numerous illustrative tales, many with animal protagonists from lice to lions. Seldom has a Machiavellian sensibility found more delightful expression. Animal stories can be employed to illustrate other things than political philosophy. Clearly, the floating narrative lore of ancient India was collected, organized, and applied to specific topics on any number of pretexts. The great Buddhist collection of Jatakas ostensibly relate the stories of the Buddha's former births. 537 of them are preserved in Pali, many of them animal stories, and other shorter collections or particularly notable single tales are found in the numerous languages of Buddhism, Indo-Aryan or not. In a number of these tales, the Bodhisattva himself takes on an animal role. Stories beginning memorably with formulae like, once upon a time, the Bodhisattva was born as a monitor lizard, was born as a monkey, was born as a fish, was born as a parrot, or was born as an elephant. Though each is encased in a specifically Buddhist moral, the stories are internally pretty untouched. The same traits are assigned to the same animals as we find in the Panchatantra tradition: cunning jackals outwitted by their own greed, clever and resourceful monkeys, timid, cautious does, little birds with braggadocio. Just as the Buddha's former birth included a number in animal form, we must not forget that the god Vishnu descended to earth, avatar, in a number of forms or avatars, among which are the fish, the tortoise, and the boar. The line between the theriomorphic and the anthropomorphic is not so clearly drawn or significant for divinities. Animals may themselves be teachers, in addition to appearing in narratives designed to instruct. In the Upanishads, for example, not all wisdom is imparted by human sages. In Chandogya Upanishad 4, a certain Vedic student, Sachakama Jabala, receives a quarter of the knowledge of Brahman from a talkative bull, an Urshava, another quarter from a goose, a Hansa, another from some kind of water bird, a mudgu. The fire is the fourth source. No humans are involved. In another part of the same Upanishad, a chorus of dogs sings a ritual chant, an udgita, which is a pretty high style variety, which conveyed mystical significance and power to the hearer, though the surface content seems rather mundane. Om, let's eat. These are dogs, remember. Om, let's eat. Om, let's drink. Lord of food, bring food here. Bring it, Om. And if you understand what that's all about, please do let me know. It is puzzling to me. The talking goose of the Chandogya Upanishad has its counterpart in the goose go-between, familiar to everyone who has ever taken first-year Sanskrit, or at least in the traditional way. In the epic Mahabharata story of King Nala and the beautiful princess Damayanti, the love of these two is fostered by a goose, a Hansa, although Western views like to make this into a swan as a sort of more glamorous animal. There are no swans, however, native to India. So disregard that guy. It's really a Hansa. The goose who, assuming a human voice, praises each to the other, conveniently flying between their two cities. To the struggling first-year Sanskrit student, it is particularly impressive that the goose has thorough control over the gerundive. Hantavyos me nate rajan, I am not to be killed by thee, O king. Matt, I think on page 3 of the Nala story in Landman's Reader. Talking birds perform other services for love or its opposite. Parrots, the talking birds par excellence, often kept as pets, can be great tattletales. In one of the Pali Jatakas, number 145, the Bodhisattva and his younger brother, born as parrots, keep watch over their wanton mistress while her husband is away. Unable to stop her behavior, they reveal it in detail to the husband on his return. The collection of Sanskrit stories called the Shuka Saptati, or 70 Tales of a Parrot, takes this situation one step further. The wanton wife in the frame story of this text is about to stray, to leave the house to meet her lover, but the pet parrot intrigues her with a question and then the story connected to it, keeping her in the house for 70 nights until the return of her husband, the original of Scheherazade with plumage. We cannot end this discussion of animal helpers without mention of the most prominent one in the Sanskrit epics. In the Ramayana, the monkey Hanuman, the chief who puts himself and his host of monkeys and bears in service of the hero Rama's quest to rescue his wife Sita from the clutches of her abductor, the 10-headed demon Ravana, and without whom success would have been impossible. Hanuman is in many ways the most sympathetic of the characters, or at least the male characters in this epic, and his prominence and popularity outstrip most of the human characters in many places where the Raman story has penetrated. When we turn to the high literature of the classical period, court poetry, kavya, and drama, animals as characters are essentially absent, but they're staples of the symbolic system of regularly repeated poetic comparisons, often with a stable set of associations that a poet can tap into simply by mentioning the particular beast. Thus, marital fidelity and the poignance of separation are instantly evoked by the mention of the Chakravaka bird, the ruddy shelduck, pairs of which are said to be devoted to each other, but condemned always to spend their nights apart. The coming of the rainy season, a standard theme in Sanskrit poetry, is signaled by the dancing of the peacock. Kama, the god of love, has a bow with a bowstring consisting of bees and arrows of flowers. And the bee therefore has twin associations with Eros and spring. In one famous Sanskrit drama, these associations are transformed into dramatic action. In Kalidasa's Shakuntala, the eponymous, barely pubescent heroine is pursued by a bee in a flowering grove, an annoyance that precipitates her first meeting with the king who will become her lover. I can't see Shakuntala here. Can you see it on your screen, on the screen? I have, okay, where am I?
I can see it.
Okay, you can see it now, or could you see it before?
Could see it before.
Okay, it's just that there's a group of people, you know, that, okay, so let's go back here. So you can still see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, those things that look like big hummingbirds, I think are meant to be bees in this picture.
Yeah.
Shakuntala is over here on the right, surrounded by these bees. There's only one bee in the actual drama. So the king emerges from his lurking place to save her from the bee. A scene surely meant as artless and charming, but I'm afraid to our cynical modern Me Too sensibilities, one that can seem both cloying and prurient. In a twist on the talkative animals encountered above, Kalidasa also offers a scene full of frustratingly mute animals. In the drama Vikram Urvashi, when King Pururavas, maddened with grief by the disappearance of his lover, the Apsaras Urvashi, roams the forest asking animal after animal to tell him if they have seen her, and each remains silent or at best utters a characteristic animal noise. But enough of this careering through ancient Indian literature. Let me now focus on a few cases taken from my own work, drawn for the most part from earlier texts and designed to show the acute observation of animal anatomy and behavior that is incorporated into the treatment of animals in these texts. Let us start with frogs. One of the most famous hymns in the Rig Veda Our oldest Sanskrit text is 7103, the so-called frog hymn, so-called already in ancient times. A much translated and much discussed poem. Opinions about its purport have traditionally been split. Is it a rain charm based on the association between frogs and the rains? Or is it a satire on Brahmins and meant to be humorous? In fact, I would argue that it's neither or a bit of both. The hymn works systematically on two levels. The vocabulary and images are simultaneously applicable to humans engaging in study and ritual activity, and to frogs before and during the rainy season. The extended pun linking frogs and Brahmins is neither a trivializing joke nor mere literary preciosity. The verbal connections between the two function exactly like the physical homologies called bandhus between the natural world and the ritual realm that so characterize Vedic religion. Microcosm can control macrocosm if only the secret identifications between them are known and expressed. Because homologies are often efficacious, only efficacious if they are observationally accurate. The frog hymn presents quite accurate descriptions of frog behavior, as I learned from reading up in the modern natural history frog literature. And noting them enriches our understanding of the ritual application of the hymn. Before I lead us through the hymn, which I promise you is short, let us start with what the frogs say. And the frogs say, akkala, an undeniably froggy sound, at least to me, which can proudly take its place with the other great literary representation of frog vocalism, Aristophanes' brekkekex koax koax in ancient Greek, as well as the distinctly less distinguished English ribbit. In the third verse of our hymn, it is said that the frogs are making akkala. In a verbal compound akkali kurcha, sorry, I left out the accent. That is also the first example of a particular syntactic construction in Sanskrit, the so-called chvi formation. But the froggy akkala conceals a secret. It is, as the great 20th century Sanskritist Paltima demonstrated, a Middle Indo-Aryan dialect version of the word akshara, syllable. While the frogs, the overt subjects of the hymn, are making ribbit, their covert counterparts, the Brahmins, are making syllables. And what does that mean? As the context makes clear, a pedagogical scene is depicted with the students repeating by rote the text, the syllables pronounced by their teacher, a form of traditional instruction still found in pockets in India today. So the relevant part here, so we have the frogs saying akkala, or repeating syllables, like a son to a father at lessons. And then once one of them speaks the speech of the other, like a pupil that of the teacher, then a whole section of them speaks as if in unison. So the context here, the human context, is a pedagogical context. The hymn begins with the frogs who have lain silent for a year, uttering speech in loud chorus like a herd of cows when the rains come. So having lain still for a year, like Brahmins following their commandment, the frogs have spoken forth a speech quickened by Parjanya, the thunder. When the heavenly rains have come to him, lying like a dried leather bag in the pond, like the bellow of cows with their calves, the call of the frogs comes together here. The frog's silence, previous silence, is no doubt that of estivation. The rains trigger the emergence of the frogs and the awesome cacophony of their croaking. But the rains also occasion the breeding season, and the frogs' croaking is primarily a breeding cry uttered by males to attract females. Many anurans, namely frogs and toads, engage in so-called, quote, explosive breeding. Natural history literature is full of wonderful terms. Explosive breeding is, quote, short-term dense breeding aggregations where combinations of temperature and heavy rainfall initiate migrations to breeding sites, frequently temporary ponds, end quote. In such circumstances, females are usually attracted to the site by a chorus of male vocalizations. The chorus often begins with one frog seeming to answer another and then builds to a general din. Both the initial antiphonal structure and the later mass choral effect are described in our hymn in verses 3 through 5, as we saw slightly above. So again, once one of them speaks the speech of the other, then a whole section of them speaks as if in unison. The calls of different species of frogs are quite distinctive and serve as, quote, isolating mechanisms, end quote, allowing females to recognize conspecific males, a phenomenon clearly reflected in verse 6. One of them has a cow's bellow, one a goat's bleat, one is speckled, one green, bearing the same name, namely frog, but different forms. They ornament their voices in many ways as they speak. So presumably we have a number of different species gathered here together. Verse 4 contains the phrase, one of the two grasps the other from behind. In most translations, this verb has been attenuated to something like greet or respond, or even jokingly play leapfrog. But in fact, this lexeme is a perfect description of the mating posture of anurans. And this mating posture is the most conspicuous visual feature, as croaking is the most conspicuous auditory one, of the frog's emergence at the reins. Anurans approach females from behind, clasping them around the middle with their forefeet, as you can see in this wonderful picture, which in many species develop special nuptial pads. That is a direct quote from the natural history literature and is one of the great, great terms I have ever encountered. Nuptial pads, this seems to be his nuptial pad. He developed nuptial pads in breeding season to facilitate holding on. This clasping position is known as amplexus. Among explosive breeders, quote, males usually acquire mates through scramble competition, that, end quote, wildly catching at anything of reasonably appropriate size and shape, including other males, salamanders, beer cans, though obviously not in ancient India, clumps of mud, and so on, until they find a willing female. When a proper pairing has finally been achieved, however, it lasts for hours, days, weeks, or even months. And the clasping reflex will often override self-protective flight or concealment reactions, thus remaining visible to any curious human observer, among whom I would count our ancient Indian poet. Thus, the first half of this short Rigvedic hymn contains a concise, observationally accurate account of the mating behavior of frogs, as comparison with the modern discussions of frog breeding demonstrates. In the later parts of the hymn, this mating behavior comes to its logical conclusion, the production of eggs, an image that is mediated through a ritual reference. Recognizing the appropriateness of the ritual terminology requires bringing together two pieces of seemingly unconnected knowledge. An apparently irrelevant term is applied to the frogs in verse 8. Carmina, possessing the heated ritual milk drink, which might not be a particularly froggy thing to do. And in the next verse, it is said that the heated ritual milk drinks, the garmha, obtain their own release. Now, the heated milk drink, the karma, is a component of a particular ritual known as the pravargya, in which one oblation involves the rapid heating and explosive boiling over of a mess of milk, an experience most of us have had after leaving milk for too long on the stove. The image of this ritual action, I think, also reflects the end of the frog's mating process. Anurans in general lay masses of eggs, quote, as high as 2,000 plus in some Indian species, end quote, usually held together in strings or clumps, often by gelatinous material. The eggs are fertilized by the male as they are released. This prodigious discharge of eggs, especially by numerous pairs simultaneously or in quick succession, could well remind the observer of the bubbling over of an overheated milk pot. This is the end of that particular breeding experience. So the poet here is not simply carried away by his knowledge of frog behavior, for the abundant discharge of eggs serves as a model for the goal of the hymn, to assure a similar gushing of fertility in the human sphere. The last verse makes this quite clear. The frogs are credited with bestowing a great abundance of goods and, crucially, the extension of our lifetimes. So the one with a cow's bellow has given, the one with a goat's bleat has given, the speckled one has given, the green one has given us goods. The frogs, giving hundreds of cows, lengthen their and our life at a pressing of thousands. So just as the frogs are impressively fertile, so will we be. Natural history, ritual science, and worldly aims join seamlessly in this little virtuosic piece. Let us now turn to mammals, and first to hyenas, perhaps not the most superficially appealing mammalian, though I developed quite a fondness for them in the course of research. Our visit with hyenas will be relatively brief. Middle Vedic literature contains a number of variants on a minor myth in which the great warrior god Indra hands over a set of ritual priests called yatis to creatures called salavarkas to eat on the ritual altar itself. So all of the versions of this myth begin with the formulaic opening. Indra handed over the yatis to the salavarkayas. And I'll give you one example of the development. The salavarkayas ate the yati priests. The yatis being taken, being seized, went up upon the upper altar, the Uttaravedi. The salavarkayas, did not dare against them. One of them, that is one of the yatis, smiled. Then they dared against them. Tearing them off the altar one by one, they ate them. Now, it's a shocking image, I think. The desecration of the ritual ground and the slaughter of the priests by the agency of a god, Indra, presumably being worshipped there by the very priest that he fed to the beasts. The word salavarka clearly refers to some variety of wild animal, presumably one fierce enough to eat up adult humans. Various identifications have been suggested for it. Etymology is no actual help. Among them, the hyena. I am convinced not only that this is the correct match, but that our interpretation of this myth is entirely changed if we view it in the light of certain facts about hyenas. This reinterpretation takes place in part through an unexpected alliance between natural history and grammar. At least in my view, grammar often gives us clues we can't find elsewhere. The young animals in the myth are actually called salavarkayas, a word formed with the suffix aya. Now, this suffix ordinarily makes matronymics, words referencing the mother as patronymics do the father. So the word should mean the young of the female Salaverka. And in fact, it turns out that the only adult Salaverkas mentioned in the text are females. This reminds us of a curious fact about the Greek word for the same animal, hyena, which is also always feminine in grammatical gender. And this brings us to another set of curious physiological facts. Among hyenas, the sexes look very much alike. The male's sexual organs are small and hard to see, so that only nursing mothers are readily identified by gender. Moreover, hyena societies seem to show female dominance. I would suggest that the great warrior god Indra is taking the role of a female hyena in this myth. This would not be the only time that Indra is turned into a female. He has been transformed into this beast, a transformation alluded to elsewhere. Since mother hyenas bring food to their young and take them on their first hunts, this is the most adorable picture of a striped hyena I could find. This apparently shocking myth actually presents us with a sweet maternal vision. As a motherly act of nurture, Indra's action may not inspire the horror that the desecration of the ritual and the betrayal of the priests might be expected to evoke. In other words, under this interpretation, this is not a story of Indra, the violent warrior, callously handing over his own priest to a pack of ravening beasts, but rather of Indra in the guise of a protective mother feeding her cubs. Too bad about the priest, though. The correct interpretation of the myth rests on a correct appreciation of the character of the animals described in it. And now to rhinoceroses. And a case that seems at first to counter the message of this talk, that we should expect a certain observational accuracy in ancient Indian descriptions of animals and their behavior. For at first glance, the passages I'm about to discuss seem to contain a simple blunder. The case in question is a provision in a number of legal texts concerning what animals may and may not be eaten, which is a major preoccupation of the Dharma literature. The general provision in question is that animals with 5 nails, i.e. 5 toes, cannot be eaten. But there is a list of exceptions, 5-toed animals that are edible. Among them are the porcupine, the hedgehog, the monitor lizard, the tortoise, the hare, and the rhinoceros. I give you the version in the Manava Dharma Shastra, the laws of Manu. So one should not eat, blah, 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 nor all 5 nailed animals, but they proclaim as edible the porcupine, the hedgehog, the monitor lizard, the rhinoceros, the tortoise, and the hare among the 5 nailed. Okay, so what's the problem? As it happens, rhinoceroses have only 3 toes. As far as I know, I am the only person in 2 millennia or so to be disturbed by this apparent lapse. Now, you might object that this fact is of dubious relevance. If ancient Indian jurists were anything like modern Western ones, they probably had little direct experience with rhinos in the wild. And if they encountered them, they probably had more pressing things to do than dispassionately examine their feet. However, as it turns out, holding the text to their putative standards of accuracy will pay off in this case as well. Comparison with other texts containing similar provisions shows that the rhinoceros is a late addition to the list, as Heinrich Luders pointed out over a century ago. The original list contained only 5 animals, resulting in the catchy and widespread formula, 5 nailed animals can be eaten, or in Sanskrit, pancha pancha naka bhakshya, a closed set into which the rhinoceros was mistakenly imported. The places where this formulation is found are quite instructive, for it occurs infrequently. The pancha pancha naka bhakshya expression occurs infrequently in the legal text, but is better represented in other text types. We find it in narrative literature, memorably in the Ramayana, when the monkey Valan, treacherously shot from behind by Rama, taunts him for killing an animal he can't eat, using exact legalistic phraseology, which, since he was dying, it seems a little, impressive. 5 nailed creatures can be eaten by Brahmins and Kshatriyas: hedgehog, porcupine, monitor lizard, hare, and tortoise as 5th. The provision is quoted also in the Kurma Purana and in Pali in Ajataka. This exact expression, pancha pancha naka bhakshya, 5 nailed can be eaten, has also penetrated ancient Indian scholasticism as a meta example in the grammatical tradition cited and used by Patanjali, and in the philosophical school of the Mimamsa. This is something of a paradox. The formula is found mostly in non-legal texts. In the Dharma tradition, where we assume it originated, it has been replaced by a spiffy revised version that includes the rhinoceros, which, however, is sadly missing 2 of the necessary toes, and whose inclusion would result in the distinctly less euphonious shat pancha naka bhakshya, 6 5 nailed animals can be eaten. Some legal texts resort to makeshifts to reconcile the original list and the addition, but there's no time to discuss them here. Given that the memorable expression 5 nailed marks this group as a closed set, how did the rhino manage to trample his way in? I suggest that it wandered in from a different part of the provision quoted. Let us look again at Manu 5:17. In the first part of the provision, it is said that one shouldn't eat solitary animals, ekachara, with no further specification. The commentators make a stab at exemplifying it. Kulukabhatta suggests snakes, etc., while Medhatati adds owls to Kuluka's snakes, but they fail to mention the ekachara animal par excellence, perhaps because by their time, this lore had disappeared from continental India. A quick glance at the modern rhino literature teaches us that rhinos are quite solitary creatures, never seen together except in breeding season, when they would have to be. This habitual behavior of the rhinoceros was also well known to the ancient Indians, at least those of the Buddhist persuasion. One of the most famous Buddhist canonical texts is the so-called Rhinoceros Sutra, or Rhinoceros Horn Sutra, Sanskrit Khadgavishana Sutra, extant in 3 different languages of early Buddhism: Pali, Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, and Gandhari, though using the term extant for the very fragmentary Gandhari version is an act of extreme courtesy. Its constant refrain is, one should wander alone like a Khadgavishana, Ekochara Khadgavisana Kappo in the Pali version. There's a certain amount of controversy about what the name of this sutra, Khadgavishana, means, a controversy that depends in part on the somewhat arcane grammatical question of what kind of compound it is. If I may oversimplify, does it mean a horn that is a sword, that is a rhinoceros horn, or having a horn that is like a sword, that is a rhinoceros. Either is possible grammatically. In the former case, the refrain is interpreted to mean one should wander alone like a rhinoceros horn. Now, to my mind, the picture this conjures up is simply absurd. And repeating it numerous times in the refrain would just make it sound sillier. But it is actually the preferred interpretation in the Pali tradition and has been the preferred modern interpretation based on the fact that the Indian rhinoceros has only one horn as opposed to the African rhinoceros with two. But I favor the latter. One should wander alone like a rhinoceros, reflecting the solitary habits of the beast. And this opinion is found elsewhere in both ancient and modern treatments, including the recent edition of the Gandhari version by Richard Solomon. Let us reconsider the passage from Manu. I suggest that the rhinoceros is intended originally as an exception to the ban on eating solitary ekachara animals. Note that the adjective ekachara, wandering alone or solitary, exactly replicates the clausal phrase ekochare, or Sanskrit ekas charet, one should wander alone, applied to the rhinoceros in the Rhinoceros Sutra. The first verse of let's go back to Manu again. So I suggest that the rhino got sucked into the list of the five nailed because of his proximity to them in the Manu's provisions about solitary beasts. The first verse of this two-verse sequence contains three forbidden categories: the ekachara, solitary or wandering alone, the unknown, and then all of the panchanakas. But in the second, the rhinoceros, I think, was originally included as an exception to the solitary category, but lumped in with the mass of five nailed ones. It got absorbed by them, and the expanded list was then disseminated to other legal texts. But crucially, it didn't penetrate the fixed five-nailed list that had gotten established in the non-Dharma literature. And this is, I hope, a potentially important or at least useful methodological point. Comparing the provisions in the legal and non-legal tradition gives us a window onto the formation, the accretion of the legal text. And it also suggests that if we are looking for older versions of legal provisions, we might look for them in non-legal texts, even if they are contemporary with or even later than the legal texts in question, because they may have formulaic wording preserved, as it were, in amber, while the legal tradition modernized. And this little window got opened only because rhinoceroses have 3 toes, a fact of natural history that we might not expect to lead us directly to the minutiae of textual history. I will stop myself here from pursuing the track of other textual animals that have caught my fancy here and there: pigs and wild boars, lions, tigers, and bears, foxes, hares, and monitor lizards, and one of my most recent enthusiasms, the bearded vulture. I'll just point out that each of the 3 tracks we did pursue enhanced our understanding of their contexts. Learning more about frogs clarified the connection between the ritual purpose of the hymn and the frogs depicted therein, and enhanced our appreciation of the artistry of the hymn. Learning more about hyenas radically changed our perception of the myth they were found in. And learning more about rhinoceros toes both called attention to an unnoticed textual problem and gave us a new way to think about archaisms and innovations in particular genres of text. But actually, I have to admit that for me, they were mostly a huge lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. It was really interesting. We have plenty of time for questions. So for anyone, I should mention this at the start. So if you want to ask questions in person, just choose the hand raise function. Or if you want to put one in the chat, that's fine, but you should direct the chat to me, David Brick, so I'll be able to read it and kind of pass it on. Not to Clemente, but to me. Oh, Tom, you have a hand?
Thank you for that lovely talk, Stephanie.
I can't imagine anyone I would like more to like it.
It is a commonplace that the gods love that which is recondite.
Right.
And that is why the Kavis who composed the poetry of the Veda, the earliest religious texts, which you and Joel Brereton have translated, the Rig Veda, write poetry that is very recondite, very hard. It's tough. It's not folk poetry. It's not crude savages. It's very recondite intellectuals, loving complexity and what is very, very subtle and tricky. I would amend this commonplace to say, the gods and Stephanie Jamison love that which is recondite.
Well, you can't spend, decades of your life on the Rig Veda without having that particular interest.
Yeah, those of you who have had the pleasure of reading your book about the sacrificer's wife and the sacrificed wife, about really gender relations in the Rig Veda and the Veda period generally, will recognize that the poetry is very complex, but also the ritual context of it is very recondite and hard for us to be sure what is meant at any given time and so on. This is very, very tough stuff. So my hat's off to you. This was just wonderful. I loved every bit of it. I have a half-finished thought I can't quite complete. That is about the three toes of the rhinoceros. Of course, you've been reading lots of natural history, and you doubtless know that modern naturalists imbued by Darwinian evolution have noticed that whether the animal has an odd or an even number of toes is hugely consequential. The cow that has the split hoof, that has walks on two toes, is different from the horse who walks on only one toe, the hoof. And there's a big evolutionary branching between the ones who have even numbered toes and those who have odd numbered toes. And some of these toes are vestigial. You have to find the remains of the other four toes of the horse by dissecting it. The rhinoceros is like that. She has three toes, but there used to be five. And the elephant has all five, and so on and so forth. But it does occur to me that a rhinoceros is somehow categorically different from a cow who's familiar, who's, who divides the hoof and chews the cud, as the Bible says, is sort of normative in that way. I'm not able to complete that thought, but the rhinoceros is strangely very important as food for the ancestors, isn't it?
Right, exactly.
The pitras, the fathers, right. We feed, they particularly like rhinoceros.
Right, and so they had to find some way to make the rhinoceros edible.
Buckshot, yes, yes.
No, there is an extraordinary amount of, to me, focus exactly on the rhinoceros as you know, as not only as food, but also, you know, the use of rhinoceros skin and so on for for various
Shields and-
ritual things. So yeah, there must have been a lot more rhinoceroses around at that period than there are now, unfortunately.
Thank you. You're going to keep me up all night thinking about this.
Oh, well, please send me your thoughts in the morning, please. California time.
There's a question in the chat. So I don't know if it's a good time to cut in. Jonathan Harrison has asked, he's commented on the frog hymn, thought it was interesting, but wants to know who would have been the audience, do you think, for the frog hymn? And also, I'll add a little kind of connection with that. Would that have been, what would have been the ritual use?
Well, it is actually,
Was there a ritual use?
it mentions specifically the pravargya.
Oh, right, of course, yeah.
Which is, so not only does it have the karma drinks, but it actually does say that it's performed, that there is a pravargya. Pravargya being a somewhat esoteric ritual. And so whether or not it was recited then, it certainly was occasioned by the thought of a pravargya, I would say. But that's not the standard, you know, soma ritual that we have throughout the rest of the Rig Veda. So the audience is going to be fellow Brahmins, fellow ritualists, I think. But it's interesting that it has this pedagogical part to it, and the Middle Indo-Aryan part with the Akkala from Akshara. So it's bringing in a lot of different things, and also one presumes that that some kind of early Middle Indic was the sort of the general language at home, and would be the general language for early pedagogy for kids. And so why Akkala from Akshara would be applicable to that situation is pretty clear. But it's not clear to me that this would be recited in a ritual, although it is certainly a ritual hymn. I mean, it's a hymn that was occasioned by ritual. Beyond that, I guess we don't really know.
Yeah, another question. I don't see anybody has it up. So two questions come up. One in that context with the Akkala, the change of R to L. Do you think of that as a sign of, I guess it wouldn't be an Eastern Procretism at the time, or just part of the general switching of all?
Well, in the rest of the Rig Veda, L forms are especially clustered in the 10th mandala and are generally considered to be late features, whether, you know, for whatever reason. There are, of course, some words that are across the board Rig Veda, like loka, which is found everywhere in the Rig Veda, but mostly you get L forms in 10th mandala and here. So it would be as it were, what's called a popular feature. Whether that's low register or dialect mixture, I would say low register myself.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's you know, it's definitely it's a late hymn in its mandala, and therefore probably a late hymn in general. I mean, insofar as late means anything in the Rig Veda, since the Rig Veda is not exactly young.
Yeah. And the other question I have, since I guess I don't know if anyone else has questions. We have one. I'll take this real quick, and then Matt, I'll let Matt ask. So I was struck, I'm recalling your old article on the rhinoceros toes. And one part, as I recall from that article, had to do with the collocation of goda, meaning whatever you call the thing that an archer wears,
right.
to protect their, you know, so they don't ding it up. And the connection, the collocation of those two having some effect on the rhinoceros creeping in.
Right, I can't remember my argument, frankly.
So I remember thinking it was convincing, but I was just wondering if you have over the years sort of are not, that's not your thinking anymore. 'Cause
No,
seeing
I
it-
don't think it's, I would, like many people of a certain age, I've forgotten many of the things I used to think.
Yeah.
Not, I have not, turned my back on them. I just can't remember what I said.
Yeah.
And
As
so
I
I'm,
recall, it was the use of sword, Khadga is sword.
yeah, right, yeah. Okay, thanks. You have now far better reproduced my article,
this
my
wonderful-
argument than I could.
But you haven't had sort of a retraction of that. I was just
No,
curious.
no, it's just, it's one of those things that I meant to pursue, not so much the Khadga part, but and Goda part, but the question of whether you can find legal phraseology preserved in older form in non-legal text. And I just never, the Rig Veda got in the way, basically.
Mm. It does. Matt, do you have your hand up?
Thank you for such a erudite and entertaining talk. I have a question about the relationships of animals among themselves and humans. So we find in anthropological literature so often that whole groups of animals or some groups of them, or even the natural order as a whole, becomes modeled on something, a human order. I'm wondering if your talk spent a lot of time mainly on individual animals and their characteristics and use in modeling human behavior. Is there any effort that you see in this literature to use relationships among at least two or maybe a number of them to model humans over against animals, or as groups, so that Brahmins and Kshatriyas are modeled on some of the animal? I mean, obviously, is there anything like that in the record?
Well, the Panchatantra and the Panchatantra, the literature, coming from the Panchatantra would certainly does that. The sort of like animal society with the various different animals interacting as a reflection of human society. What's interesting to me is that in the Veda we don't have anything that looks like the Panchatantra tradition, or we have very little that. So basically in the Veda, sort of animals show up kind of singly, but as opposed to this sort of nature reflecting, sort of animal nature reflecting human society. And since it seems as though that was the story literature tradition was so strong in classical India, I have often wondered where it was in my stuff, in the earlier stuff. And I think there's a little bit of a sign of this in one Rigvedic hymn, which is actually 1028, where you have sort of allusions to stories, so the hare and the hare and the lion or something like that. But they're just like allusions. They're sort of like very, very brief summaries of stories that we don't have. And so I wish to see that whole Panchatantra animal society thing was there, but we don't have it preserved because the story literature tradition is a kind of pedagogical tradition in a way. It's teaching, princes how to be princes, at least, say the Hitopadesha is exactly specifically that. And so I think it's just, it's a lack in the textual record, but not in what I think was probably the real record. I think they just didn't get preserved. People told those stories, but that we don't have the versions of them. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. I answered the question I sort of wanted to answer, so I'm willing to try on yours.
You covered mine as well as the one you wanted to answer.
Okay.
So.
Ben, you have your hand raised?
Yes, hi Stephanie. I'm sorry again, I had
Hi,
to join
Jen.
late. So just following up on Matt's question, when I think of animals in the Rig Veda, the first thing I think of are all the similes, like Indra being compared to a bull and so forth.
Yeah.
Do we see any kind of development out of any of those sort of very basic comparisons into any of the stuff that Matthew was alluding to?
Not that I can think of at the moment, but that may be the limitations on my memory and my knowledge. So developing into well, in one sense we do, in that Indra is always turning into things in Middle Vedic literature, and later when he, he becomes a, he becomes a, a mother hyena, for example. But it's still not, doesn't seem to be in a kind of like an animal society. It's just Indra takes on this role and does various, things. Was that your question?
Yeah, I was imagining the answer would be negative, but I didn't know if there was any hint of those sorts of similes kind of being plugged into something that might be more
Like a story.
developed. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, only the sort of crossover of the transformation of of a god into something. But again, I don't think it's a kind of one-off. The place I think one would look for it in the Middle Vedic literature is possibly Jaiminiya Brahmana, which tends to have a sort of interesting take on stories. So there's the dolphin that doesn't praise Indra, and so Indra, tries to kill it, stuff like that. But that's not really, I think, what you're talking about.
No, thanks.
Yeah, Peggy McCracken, looks like you have your hand up.
I do. This is a question from from somebody completely outside your field. So thank you very much for the clarity of your lecture. It was really just so easy to listen to, and I learned a lot. Just following up, really on the discussion underway, the three examples you gave us. One was about frogs kind of doing their thing, and two were about people killing animals to eat. And so I guess I'm wondering, you mentioned that you've thought about lots of other animal examples, and I wonder if it's, without being overly taxonomical, if they are, when you say that animals are good to think with, are these texts thinking mostly about human animal difference in terms of domination and use? Or would they tend more toward the froggy examples of sort of recognition of animal behavior that might have symbolic importance for people? I'm not sure those are opposites, but just I'm just wondering about I'm struck by the two examples of meat eating, and I'm just wondering about how difference might be inscribed in terms of domination.
Yeah, I don't have a good general answer to that, in part because the animals I've talked about and looked at, I've sort of come, I stumble across them by accident. So I've never sort of done a kind of comprehensive, let's gather all the animals together. I did, well, let's start with the fact that the Rig Veda has a lot of human to human killing in it. I mean, it's a fairly hostile text in certain ways, but it's not being, and so that is going to be part of that's going to sort of set the terms of the discourse. But what's kind of interesting about the Rig Veda is that there are almost no wild animals in it. Certainly not the sort of the lions and tigers and bears and leopards and so on that you kind of expect. And that immediately changes in the next text in the Atharva Veda. You start getting lots of lions and so on. And so clearly, they were around, but they used them for their own purposes. And so the sort of majestic wild animals of the lions and tigers variety get associated with kingship and that kind of power. And so there, if you're looking at those animals, you would probably find a great deal of discussion of or mirroring of the dominance that you're talking about. So, and that, that is very, very prominent in the Atharva Veda, where kingship has become a very big thing. Mostly in the Rig Veda, you talk a lot about cows. I mean, you talk about a lot, but it's a really interesting question, and I don't have a good answer because, as I said, I haven't really thought about it in a general way. But it would be nice to have somebody, probably not me at this point, do a kind of survey of how animals get used in all of these texts. I mean, it is, on the other hand, you get these, in the Upanishads, late Vedic, but Chandogya Upanishad is, fairly early for Upanishad. The animals that give this student the knowledge of Brahman. So there's no, the dominance there would be intellectual rather than in terms of power dynamics or, raw power dynamics. And then there's some part of the Upanishads where there are a couple of geese who are flying over something and they chat to each other about stuff. But curiously, animals don't tend to interact with each other in the Veda. They interact with humans. Whereas they do, the whole story literature tradition has animals interacting with each other. And I don't know if that's a change or if it's just the textual record that we've got. But I'll think about it. I'll try,
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Elena, Bashir?
Yes, yeah. I have a question which follows almost immediately from something you just said, Stephanie, about an animal who taught a student the knowledge of Brahma. So my question was, and still is, do other incidents or stories come to mind in which animals are presented as creatures from whom humans can learn?
Again, this is since I haven't done a complete survey, I can't think about this right. I can't think of an example right away. But it's a really interesting question. And I don't have an answer.
Okay,
Sorry.
at least there's one which you yourself mentioned about the animals telling their students.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. At least one. So.
Well, and if you want to think that the talking goose in the Nala story is they're not learning, wisdom, but they are learning about each other from, the girl and the boy, the prince and the princess, are being talked to by the goose, and he says, Nala's really gorgeous and he's really smart, which is really totally wrong. And you should marry him, and Damayanti is a beautiful woman and she loves you. So there's the goose as a go-between is, at least conveying information, if not wisdom.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's another person with a hand up. I don't have a name. CMB?
Hi, I'm Celia, thanks.
Okay.
So I'm still thinking about the rhinoceros, I suppose, and please forgive me for also not coming from a great deal of knowledge about ancient India. But it strikes me that in the Rig Veda, there is quite a bit of conversation about what makes for a good sacrifice. And it strikes me that you've been talking about what makes for something that can be eaten. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about, is a rhino a bad sacrifice or a good sacrifice? Or what makes, what's the difference, I guess, between food and sacrifices?
Well, at least in the early Vedic period, they wouldn't be eating these, probably some, okay. Animal sacrifice in Vedic in Rig Veda is pretty limited. There is a little bit of discussion of the horse sacrifice. But in Middle Vedic period, there are vast numbers of wild animals that are tied up to sacrificial posts during this horse sacrifice, or at least that's what they tell us. I mean, whether this is true or not is another matter, but they're all released. The horse is sacrificed, but all of these other wild animals are actually released from what, from what would be a post to which they would be tied. So they wouldn't eat them in a sacrificial context. Where they do eat them is in these Shraddha dinners, which are actually a somewhat later phenomenon, where you have, which is a sort of celebration of, Brahmanhood and also the Pitters, the ancestors. And as Professor Trautmann pointed out, the rhino is eaten at Shraddhas. But that's kind of later, but we don't know because of the, the very major gaps in our textual record, if they were doing this all along, and it's just that we only have the Rig Veda from that period. I mean, the question of, what can you eat and what you can't is just as a huge issue for the Dharma texts. And I think less so in the material that I tend to work with. But again, a really interesting question.
Yeah, Ross, you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. At one point, you mentioned that animals are essentially absent from high classical Sanskrit literature as main characters. I think, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I did say that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm right, but I did say it.
I was just going to ask if you would offer some reflections on why you thought that might be the case. If there's some kind of categorical shift in thinking about animals and literature and poetry, and why they become less prominent.
Well, I would start by saying I am definitely not a kavya specialist. So I don't want, what I will say here is, strictly amateur. And I think it may be that kavya wants to distance itself from the story literature tradition, in one sense. And then on the other hand, leaving aside Hanuman and so on, there are not a whole lot of talking characters in the epics, especially the Mahabharata. And so much of the kavya tradition is taking, plots from the epic tradition and developing them. So that would be my immediate thought, but I would not, as I said, I'm not a specialist in this area. And I also don't know, in my, sweeping statement, that there aren't any animal characters in kavya, or there are few. Whether I have, just completely forgotten some, really obvious, well-known piece of work or body of work. So part of this was to find out if anybody would say to me, but you've forgotten Kalidasa's X, where, the monitor lizard is the main character. But I think, it's not elevated enough. Animal characters, I think, are not elevated enough to make, to take roles in kavya, but they certainly are there constantly in similes and other kinds of, poetic tropes. Peacocks are always dancing, and does are always having eyes, and geese are always, compared to women and walking and so on, or women walking are always compared to geese. So they're everywhere in kavya. They just don't seem to have, like full roles that I can think of. But as I said, anybody who can correct me, I would be delighted to hear it.
Yeah, I was trying to rack my brain about that issue when you were saying it, and I'm not a specialist in Kavya either, though I read a fair amount. I can't think of much. I mean, there's the Abhisheka Natakam that has Hanuman and Sugriva
Yeah.
and Valin as kind of central characters, but they're very much on the anthropomorphic side. By that point, they're quite virtually humans. I
Well,
think
kind
from
of
that, I don't know, but that's a late play. That's kind of one, but otherwise I can't
Yeah.
think of much. I really can't. Maybe some of the cows that are getting protected in Raghuvamsha or something.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, the Urvashi, the Vikram Urvashi scene where he goes around to all of the animals is, you know, one of the only places where there's a lot of actual animal characters, but they don't say anything.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole question of what that, you know, how old that scene is and so on and so forth, because that has, anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Were there any more questions? Oh, Ben, you have your hand up again, or is it an old one?
No, I put it back up because I suddenly thought of Vrshakapi. I don't know if you talked about Vrshakapi earlier.
No, I
Is there
didn't
anything
talk
kinda
about
like-
Vrshakapi.
Is there anything kind of like Vrshakapi and that whole hymn in other either
Yeah,
Vedic
for
or
those of you
Hindu?
who don't know, Vrshakapi, I could be probably, you know, banished for, you know, sort of speech here, but there's a famous hymn in the Rig Veda in which a monkey named Vrshakapi, who's a great pal of Indra's, makes quite vulgar advances to Indra's wife. And essentially says, you know, you really want it, don't you, goddess? And she first says no, and then she, well, in any case, it's a dialogue in which Vrshakapi, the monkey, has a major role, where I think he's actually a stand-in for the horse of the Ashvamedha, but it's a very memorable hymn, and that the monkey is certainly a talking monkey, again, interacting with humans. Or no, not humans, gods, whatever. But, you know, anthropomorphic divinities. Was that your question, Ben?
I was just wondering if there was anything else kind of like that later on.
I don't think so. There are certain things about, you know, the Rig Veda I could get away with it. Nothing else would. I mean, oddly enough, I don't think there are any places in which the horse of the Ashvamedha gets to be anything but a sort of function. You know, you don't have a sort of horse, a talking horse saying what it was like to be part of the Ashvamedha. So.
There's a comment about giant agamas and the kind of role of animals in that literature. Have you
Never.
considered those at all?
No, a very interesting place to explore, but I have not done that.
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Comments? Then maybe we should end a few minutes early then. And
Tom has a question.
oh, there's one more. Oh, sorry, Tom, definitely.
Am I unmuted?
Yep. Yeah, you are.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've enjoyed this a great deal. It makes me think about Edgerton, whose name came up.
Right.
I'm a great admirer of his. And he, of course, wrote a wonderful book about elephants.
Right.
That was very philological as well as natural historical. I mean, he gives all sorts of stuff about new words or new meanings of Sanskrit words that haven't been noted before in dictionaries, et cetera, et cetera. He does the whole thing very carefully and very thoroughly, as we might expect from the scholar of the Buddhist Sanskrit hybrid Sanskrit dictionary. he also took a great interest in the Panchatantra, as you remarked, and also the Vetala Panchavinshati. He thought it important to study folklore, in other words, folk
Yeah,
tales,
yeah.
as well as high register stuff. And he thought elephants were so everywhere in Sanskrit literature and so acutely observed and rendered in many ways that philology ought to pay more attention to it. And I think you've shown in your talk what philology can do, what surprising, unexpected things.
Well,
Even
that
the
would be
talk of frogs.
that would be my message, because I'm an unreconstructed, old-fashioned philologist and proud to
Yeah.
use the term.
Yeah. And its power is evident in this talk, I think. I mean, the way in which it reaches beyond itself to natural history observation and how that illuminates what is recondite. So more power to you. Thank you so much for making what is very difficult, very easy for us to follow you in and to get into, including the mating of frogs and the frothy business that is. And
Well,
how it's like when the oatmeal boils over on the stove and your little child is horrified by what happens, which is the image that came to my mind for personal reasons. I thank you for all that. And I just feel I'm left with these feelings about there's a strong folk element out there, but there's also, even in the very highest and most rarefied registers of ancient Indian thought, there's something that to be known about animals that is really essential to disentangling those complexities. So thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful talk.
well, thank you so much for being a wonderful audience, and I am delighted to have had this opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you. I guess a round of applause for Professor Jamison.